Okay. Who else stayed up last night watching SummerSlam? No, not a lot of wrestling fans. Well, no, that's fine, because it's interesting. I had my personal wrestling phase in middle school. I would stay up and watch WWE stuff. And then Xavier had one like later, and then it went away. And then, as it always does, like it came back. And last night they had this big event, and I watched it, and I was like, this is awesome. You know, like it's fun. Basically, all it is a soap opera of big sweaty men slapping each other. Like that's all it is. And the stories that they tell are absolutely wonderful. For example, last night in one of the matches, I legitimately thought somebody got hurt. Like that they busted their knee doing some flip or getting thrown out of the ring or something. And then all of a sudden, like, she comes flying back in, jumps off the top rope, and I'm like, there's no way her knee hurts. But what's interesting is, though, like, they do get hurt. All of that stuff that you see on TV, like, it's predetermined and it's more or less scripted, but people can and do oftentimes get hurt. But here's the thing. They can't legally call it wrestling. And the reason that they can't is because it's not wrestling. Like, I've seen wrestling, like, from high school people and from the Olympics, and there are no ropes, there are no steel chairs or trash cans or anything like that. It's people grappling with each other, trying to overpower them. That's what wrestling at its core is. It still hurts. Still looks like it would hurt. I had friends who wrestled, and I would all the time worry about them because I would watch them in these matches getting, like, sort of flipped over and tossed about and bent up like a pretzel. And I didn't want them to be hurt. But they did what they did because it mattered to them. It wasn't necessarily like this pride or glory thing that they had. It was just, this is what I'm going to do. It's interesting that our reading this morning from Genesis features wrestling, the boring kind, if you will. We have Jacob in one corner, and we have God in another corner. An angel. It's never really clear exactly who it is that he's wrestling, but most people will say, oh, he's wrestling with God, and there's a reason for that. Like professional wrestling, sports entertainment, whatever you call it, it tells a story. And it tells a very interesting story that actually has, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful images of our daily lives with God. Jacob at this point is still a scoundrel. He has done his heel move, the bad guy move, as it were. And what he has done is he has taken Esau's birthright. He has stolen the blessing from his father. He has gone and he has been married, and there has been issues with who he has married and why. And so he has this little bit of payback there. And now he still is on the run from Esau because, not metaphorically, but literally, Esau will kill him. So he goes and he takes his family and his possessions and he says, all right, you guys stay here. He goes off. And as he's there, he sees somebody. And for whatever reason, they decide to wrestle. There's no ref, there's no bell, but they start to wrestle. And this is the beauty. Jacob's life up till this point has been a struggle. Now, some of it is of his own doing. There's something to be said for kind of creating your own problem and then having to deal with it. Some of it has been a little forced on him, but the fact of the matter is, his life to this point has not been easy, which is why we can identify with Jacob. It's not necessarily that he's like a scoundrel or anything, but when you look at the story of his life, you see a flawed person just trying to do what he thinks is best to get through life. And that is what life is. Our lives are a struggle at times. They're not always easy. They're not meant to be easy. And so in the midst of this, in the midst of his own personal struggles, figuring out his identity, who he is, what he wants, he wrestles with God. And that is a beautiful image. There's different ways to receive the good news of God, the good news of Jesus Christ. One of them is very passive. You have somebody explain and tell you things, and they'll say, this is what you believe. This is what you're supposed to say. These are the canon events. This is what's the most important. There are stories contained in the Bible that you will likely not ever hear preached from a pulpit. Has anyone ever heard or preached on the she-bears? Prophets of Baal, they sometimes get preached about. Balaam's donkey, sometimes. The Nephilim. And when was the last time you can honestly say you heard a sermon about the Nephilim? Or perhaps the Book of the Watchers and how that relates to things with these angelic beings. When I found these texts, it's not that it shook everything. It's not that it made me question anything. But my question was, what do I do with this? Why is there a story of a talking donkey? Why are there these half angel, half human beings running around? And what it did was light a fire in me. A fire for knowledge. There are texts in the Bible classically referred to as texts of terror because they're scary and terrifying. What do we do with those? Do we ignore them? If we ignore everything that we don't like in the Bible, we're cutting out probably 3/4 at least of the Bible. Christianity, our faith, our practice, it's not meant to be this passive thing where we're just receiving and receiving things. It's meant to be a struggle. And this is why Jacob wrestling with God is such a beautiful image. What do you say to someone who has lost everything or lost a loved one? What do you say to people who question the existence of God because they don't see God displayed in the world? How do you talk to them? Why do bad things happen to good people, and why do good things happen to bad people? The questions that keep us up at night, this is the struggle of our faith. And what's fascinating here is not necessarily that this is a wrestling match against God. In fact, what we read is when God gives Jacob his new name, Israel. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. Not against. If it was supposed to be against, it would say against. But see, God and Jacob, they were not antagonistic forces. It was with. That's the beauty. Our faith should not be a passive thing that we receive. We need to grapple with our faith and understand truly and honestly what it all means. Because when we look at the world around us, what do we see? We see more struggle. We see more pain. We see more strife than we know what to do with. So what are we to do? Well, we have a choice to make. We can either sit back and just passively receive these things, or we can struggle with God. Not against, but with God. When we do that, something interesting happens. See, God acknowledges that this fight is going on way too long. And he says, hey, let's, time out here. Sun's coming up. Let's stop this. And Jacob says, no, not until you bless me. Because he knows that if he is struggling with God, that something will come from it. Something good will come from it. When we struggle and grapple with the questions of our faith and why it is we do what we do, I can guarantee you something good will come from it if you approach it earnestly and humbly. It's a beautiful thing that we have. And then God does what God always does and takes Jacob and changes him, gives him a new name, a reoccurring motif, if you will. Because remember, one of the last times this happened was to who? Preceding this story, it was with Abram, who became Abraham, and Sarai, who became Sarah. We see this later as Jesus meets Simon and says, your name is Peter now. We see it later even after that when we have Saul switch his name to the Roman name of Paul for the ministry that he is about to do. What is a name? I mean, after all, Shakespeare tells us a rose by any other name would smell just as sweet, right? So what is the purpose of a name? Well, a name is a symbolic thing. It's what something identifies as. The underlying metaphor here being that God has taken these people and has changed them. We see this physically in Israel from this point forward, not the nation, the person. But we see this physically, and the way that we see this physically is that he walks with a pronounced limp the rest of his days. And we even get that little throwaway line in the Passover text, was how, like, you're not supposed to eat the hip meat because of the history associated with this specific wrestling match. A change. A change to what? Spoilers for the book of Genesis, if you have not yet read so. But what happens next, there will be this time of reconciliation, there will be this time of growth, and the story of Israel, not just the person, but the fledgling nation, will continue on and to continue to go. Eventually, we'll run into the coat of many colors, we'll run into Moses and the Exodus and slavery and all of that, all the way down through history. And we'll wind up with Jesus. None of that can happen unless Jacob becomes Israel here and now. God is a God of change, which is why the struggling is there, because change, not easy, not fun. Growth is never an easy or a fun thing. In fact, we see this in our bodies. When people want to get stronger, what is it they do? Well, they go to the gym, they lift weights and do everything. But when you do that so much, your muscles tend to burn. And it's because of the lactic acid that's being released. And that's being released because as you lift weights, your muscles have these little micro tears and they build themselves back together stronger because growth is pain. I see it. I've seen it in my kids when they're like, I have no idea why my legs are hurting. You're growing. That's why. Caterpillars completely dissolve into a goo inside a cocoon before they transform into the thing that they were meant to be. Change and growth is never easy. It is a struggle. It is the struggle that we are forced to grapple with in our day-to-day lives. For we can either be passive receptors of our faith and just go along living as if we know everything, but not making the changes to show the world that we have actually changed, or we struggle against the slings and arrows of this world in order to do that which we have been called to do. Faith as it exists, not super logical if we're being honest. And we see that in the gospel text this morning. Jesus doing what Jesus does. He's out walking around, talking to people and preaching. And he goes off a little ways outside of the city limits, and the crowds followed him. And he went to a deserted place by himself. It was like the classic parent thing of like, I just need 5 minutes of being left alone, right? And so he goes off and he comes back and everyone's still there. And what he does is fascinating because we've all been in that spot, right? That spot of like, give me 5 minutes. just 5 minutes to sort of like recharge myself. And so when he comes ashore, what does he see? He sees this great throng of people. And does he send them away? No. What we read is that he had compassion on them. And he cured the sick. We don't know how long it took. We don't know exactly how tired Jesus was. But what I can tell you this is that part of what we profess is that Jesus, while being fully God, was also fully human. And if you don't think that spending all day interacting with people and talking to people is exhausting, it is. Not to mention the fact that I have no idea how draining it must feel to keep healing people nonstop, and the amount of people that is there, because it takes so long, it's now supper time. And the disciples, being pragmatic, are like, hey, these people need to go home. Like, it is late. They need to be fed. And Jesus just looks at them and says, nah, you feed them. Five loaves and 2 fish. I can remember in the early days of the COVID pandemic when everybody was stockpiling toilet paper. And so here's the thing. We went to Sam's Club, as one with a large family is wont to do, and attempted to get some groceries. And one of those things that we always buy in bulk is toilet paper. And there was none. And then the next time we went, it was a sign, 1 per person. And I can remember thinking to myself, like, yeah, but this isn't stockpiling for us. This is like normal grocery shopping for us. My point is this. Mathematically speaking, we should know what is and isn't enough for a group of people. That's why we plan. That's why we have sign-up sheets for church potlucks, so we know who's coming and we know about how much we need to make food-wise, right? Because if you're not prepared, you're not going to have enough. There was no way they prepared for this. Not with only scrounging together and finding 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And yet Jesus tells them, hey, go feed them with this. And mathematically, this is not possible. It's not something that should happen, and yet it does. And it does so in such this interesting, it's almost throwawayable how this thing happens, because they take this stuff to Jesus and he blesses it and he breaks it and he gives it to the disciples and say, here, you feed them. I would like to think in that moment the disciples learned yet another powerful lesson about the provision of God. And that being a part of something that was impossible changed something in them. Because that's what God does. God is a God of growth. God is a God of change. We are called as followers of Christ every day to do the impossible, which is simply make the world a better place. And we're called to do that by talking with people, by serving people, and by loving people. But have you met people? We don't always see eye to eye. We don't always agree on things. And yet these are the people that we are called to love and to serve. It causes friction. It causes chaos. It causes struggle. I have learned to have to pray for people that, quite frankly, I didn't want to. And I don't use this as saying, like, people in churches, but people that I know outside of church communities who have done incredibly horrifying things. I'm called to pray for them. We're called to pray for people we don't like and people that we deem as evil. We're called to pray for people like Putin. When was the last time you earnestly prayed for Vladimir Putin? Yet we're called to do that. That's a struggle. That's a personal struggle that we face, that we have to do, because being a follower of Jesus is not an easy thing at all. We are called to do the impossible. And the only way that we can do that is if we are changed, if we are transformed, to use the language that Paul uses later, a new creation in Christ. Something different, something new. When you have that change, when you have that transformation, through the struggle, through the pain, through grappling with the text, through grappling with God, with the world and our place in it, it is then that we realize that through Christ we are able to do the impossible that God has set before us. We need to dream big. Because while it is not easy, if we are truly committed to struggling with God, not against God, but with God, we can change the world. But first, it starts with our own struggle of change. Even if we do something small, it can change the world for one person. Because God loves us all. Amen.